A July afternoon in Horseshoe Bend. The roar of dozens of motorcycles tears through the silence of the New South Wales interior. The Hells Angels, the world's most feared club, breached the gates of Australia's most sacred territory. The Gladiators MC clubhouse. Fire, gunshots, a clear order. Retire or die. 65 years of history faces its darkest night. This is the story of the day Australia's oldest club fought its final battle for survival. On July 23, 2025, Port Stephens Hunter Police received multiple emergency calls from Horseshoe Bend, a quiet suburb of Maitland, 200 kilometers north of Sydney. Witnesses report dozens of motorcycles, gunfire, and a fire at the Gladiators Motorcycle Club clubhouse. When authorities arrive, they find the building partially destroyed by flames, bullet casings on the ground, and a 63-year-old man hospitalized with minor burns. The case is immediately transferred to the Raptor Squad, New South Wales Elite Organized Crime Unit. Investigators quickly discover this was no accidental fire or common vandalism. It was a military operation executed by the Hells Angels MC, the planet's most powerful motorcycle club. Underworld sources speak of a hostile takeover. Gladiators members were forcibly removed from their own territory, some compelled to surrender their patches and join the enemy. Others simply expelled with a deadly warning: retire or appear on a hit list. The question resonating throughout the motorcycle community is simple yet devastating. How could Australia's oldest club fall? What transformed the Gladiators, living legends of Australian asphalt, into victims of their own history? To understand the fall, one must first comprehend the birth. In 1960, when Elvis Presley dominated the airwaves and the world still processed World War II, a group of young motorcyclists gathered in Maitland, New South Wales. Maitland was no ordinary town. Since 1923, it had been the cradle of professional speedway in Australia, thanks to Johnny Hoskins, who installed the first tracks at Maitland Showground. Two-wheel culture ran through the city's veins. These men founded the Gladiators MC, the first American-style outlaw motorcycle club on Australian soil. They adopted the term one percenter, born in 1947 after the small Hollister, California disturbance. When the American Motorcyclists Association declared that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding citizens, the Gladiators proudly embraced being the remaining 1%. Their patch was unmistakable, a skull wearing a gold and red gladiator helmet. Their motto, tattooed into the club's collective memory, GFFG, Gladiators Forever, Forever Gladiators. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a blood oath. For decades, the Gladiators expanded throughout New South Wales, establishing chapters in Grafton, Gunnedah, and maintaining their historic stronghold in Maitland. While other clubs appeared and disappeared, the Gladiators remained. They survived the club wars of the 70s, the anti-motorcycle legislation of the 80s, the police raids of the 90s. Their longevity wasn't accidental. It was the result of a simple philosophy: low profile, high loyalty, small but defensible territory. But in 1975, a foreign force arrived in Australia, The Hells Angels, founded in California in 1948, established their first chapters in Melbourne and Sydney. They didn't come to share territory, they came to conquer it. Unlike the Gladiators, who had grown organically from Australian speedway roots, the Hells Angels were a global franchise with resources, international connections, and a corporate expansion mentality applied to organized crime. By 2025, the Hells Angels controlled 14 chapters in Australia with approximately 250 members. They had diversified their operation from drug trafficking and prostitution toward legitimate businesses, gyms, tattoo studios, transport companies, private security. The club had evolved from street gang to criminal conglomerate. The Gladiators, in contrast, remain what they had always been, a traditional motorcycle club with modest operations and a philosophy of passive resistance before more powerful giants. The tension between both clubs wasn't new. The Hells Angels had been in conflict with virtually all Australian clubs: Comancheros, Bandidos, Finks, Nomads. Their strategy was consistent: intimidation, calculated violence, and forced absorption. The term patchover had become the 21st century euphemism for describing territorial annexations in the motorcycle club world. The years preceding the July attack witnessed an aggressive Hells Angels expansion in the Hunter Corridor, the region surrounding Maitland. Police sources documented a systematic increase in pressure on independent drug dealers. The strategy was transparent: consolidate total control of the narcotics market in New South Wales. The Gladiators, with their Horseshoe Bend clubhouse, occupied strategic territory. Maitland sits at the intersection of key routes between Sydney and northern regions. Controlling Maitland meant controlling the flow. But something deeper was at stake. The Hells Angels weren't just seeking commercial territory, they were seeking historical legitimacy. In the motorcycle club underworld, seniority grants respect. The Gladiators, founded in 1960, preceded the Hells Angels' arrival in Australia by 15 years. They were the gold standard of Australian authenticity. Absorbing them wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a devastating symbolic blow, demonstrating that even pioneers could be devoured by modern power. Tensions escalated gradually. First came casual encounters that turned confrontational. Then, pressure on shared suppliers. The Gladiators attempted to maintain their historic low-profile strategy, avoiding escalation. But on July 22, 2012, Frank Vander Croft, president of the Gladiators Maitland chapter, was shot 4 times in the torso while riding his motorcycle along Wine Country Drive in North Rothbury. He survived, but the message was clear. Neutrality wasn't possible. Police raids intensified. In October 2014, Strikeforce Meanie swept through the Horseshoe Bend clubhouse searching for amphetamines. They destroyed the bar, the stage, the furniture. They found no drugs, but confiscated everything under the argument that operating an unlicensed bar was illegal. It was warfare by other means: attrition, demoralization, resource erosion. By July 2025, the Gladiators faced pressure from multiple fronts: Police, through their Raptor Squad, had transformed outlaw club life into a panopticon of constant surveillance. The Hells Angels, from their Sydney bases, had consolidated alliances with smaller clubs. Coffin Cheaters, Immortals, Red Devils, Vikings. The noose was tightening. On Wednesday, July 23rd, 2025, approximately at 6 in the evening, dozens of Harley-Davidson motorcycles bearing the red and white colors of the Hells Angels converged on Horseshoe Bend. The operation was coordinated with military precision. They blocked the exits, surrounded the clubhouse, and entered with a simple order: retire or be on a hit list. Witnesses who spoke to the press under condition of anonymity described a scene of controlled chaos. They burnt everything and shots were fired, declared a source close to the conflict. There was no epic battle or heroic resistance. The reality was more brutal and mundane, crushing numerical superiority and the threat of immediate lethal violence. Gladiators members faced an impossible choice. Some, under extreme pressure and fearing for their lives, agreed to patch over, surrender their Gladiators patches and adopt Hells Angels colors. It's the motorcycle equivalent of unconditional surrender. Others refused and were physically expelled from the clubhouse with the warning that any attempt to return or reorganize would result in fatal consequences. Fire consumed parts of the building. The symbolism was deliberate, not just defeat the gladiators, but physically erase their presence. The Horseshoe Bend Clubhouse, home to 65 years of history, was marked by smoke and ash. A 63-year-old man, whose identity wasn't publicly revealed, was arrested at the scene and hospitalized with minor burns. He was charged with malicious damage by fire and scheduled to appear at Maitland local court on September 17th. The exact circumstances of his participation remain unclear, but speculation points to a desperate act of resistance or perhaps a failed attempt to destroy evidence before the Hells Angels could confiscate it. The Raptor Squad assumed the investigation, but the police response was curiously measured. There were no mass arrests or immediate follow-up operations. The Hells Angels had executed the takeover carefully enough to avoid serious federal charges. Authorities understood that intervening aggressively could trigger open warfare between clubs, something no law enforcement agency wanted to see on New South Wales streets. Underworld sources reported a climate of terror in the Hunter region. "If the power goes out, I'm not going out to check the electrical panel," confessed a local resident familiar with the situation, illustrating the level of paranoia that settled over the community. Independent dealers received the message. The Hells Angels now controlled all drug movement in the area. Selling without their permission was a death sentence. Some Hells Angels members began moving through Maitland without their colors, a devastating psychological tactic. Impossible to know who was enemy, who was informant, who was watching. The fall of the Gladiators MC in Maitland isn't simply the story of a defeated club. It's the epitaph of an era. Founded in 1960, they survived 65 years of wars, hostile legislation, police raids, and lethal rivalries. They watched dozens of other clubs born and die. They witnessed the Hells Angels' arrival in Australia, the Milpera massacre in 1984, the Sydney Airport Brawl in 2009. They remain when others collapsed. But longevity isn't immunity. The motorcycle club world has evolved beyond recognition. What began as fraternities of war veterans and post-war rebels transformed into global criminal syndicates with corporate structures and market strategies. The Hells Angels represent that evolution. International franchise, income diversification, calculated territorial expansion. The Gladiators represented something older and perhaps more authentic. Local loyalty, tradition, organic resistance. Their defeat symbolizes the industrialization of organized motorcycle crime. Small family operations can't compete with multinational conglomerates, even when those conglomerates operate in the shadows of legality. What remains of the Gladiators? Officially, the club hasn't been dissolved. They maintain chapters in other New South Wales regions. But the loss of Maitland, their hometown, their historic fortress, is a mortal wound to their collective identity. It's as if Rome lost Rome. Authorities continue monitoring the situation with elevated alert. The fear is that the Horseshoe Bend hostile takeover is just the first move in a broader campaign of territorial consolidation. Other small clubs watch with unease. If the Gladiators, with their decades of experience and legendary status, could be absorbed so efficiently, who is safe? The true legacy of the Gladiators isn't measured in victories or defeats, but in survival. For 65 years, they defied the odds in a world where the average lifespan of an outlaw club is less than a decade. They were the gold standard of what it meant to be an Australian one-percenter before the term became synonymous with corporate drug trafficker. The night of July 23, 2025 wasn't the end of the Gladiators MC. It was the end of the illusion that tradition and seniority offer protection against brute power. In the modern world of motorcycle clubs, history is just a useful myth until it stops being one. Maitland, the city that witnessed the birth of Australian Speedway and the continent's first outlaw club, now looks toward its future with the red and white colors of the Hells Angels flying where the gold gladiator helmet once waved. The roar of motorcycles remains, but the voices driving it have changed forever.